Hello and welcome to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass, Director of Policy at the Franklin Center, and today I'm joined by
Barrett Holmes Pitner. I'm a columnist with the Daily Beast, covering race and culture and politics.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Barrett. I wanted to talk about a couple different issues. You've had a couple really thought-provoking columns recently, kind of based around where the Black Lives Matter movement is right now and where it can go in the future. And I've seen a lot of these pieces kind of crop up over the last month or so because in August it was the one-year anniversary of the death of Michael Brown. There were a lot of pieces kind of retrospective about how the movement came around, what it has accomplished. I'm interested because you wrote a really interesting piece on where the movement goes from here. So I wanted to kind of get your take on how we got here and what the, I guess, procedural tactical steps are that the Black Lives Matter movement can make now and in the near future.
Yeah, so how we got here, it's a very good question. Essentially, following the death of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Eric Garner and countless other African Americans, there was a kind of like a call to action to take to the streets and voice your frustration with their deaths, but also like the grander, just unfair like social structures, criminal justice systems that disproportionately harm African Americans. And upon doing that, a whole bunch of people showed up. It became a national movement that incorporated African Americans, but also Americans of, various races and ages and everything. And once you have just a large group of people voicing a similar frustration and the need for a change, you then have to morph into something besides just like a cathartic, emotional gathering of people. Because even though that's great, you want that energy to result in something positive happening. And to do that, you have to organize and kind of get down and do the work that's not nearly as much fun. Like it becomes almost a job. You have to create an organization. And that's kind of what's happening right now with Black Lives Matter. But then there's this, the dilemma of it, since it was just a gathering of so many different people and it wasn't like a unified, organized entity at the beginning, there's going to be different factions of Black Lives Matter that are going to try to organize and whatnot. So there's going to be like Black Lives Matter, the big organizational body, and they are organizing right now. They're kind of creating a hierarchy and giving people positions and roles and and all that kind of stuff that you need to properly relate to political figures and everybody else. And then there's other entities springing up too. So that's kind of what's happening now.
Yeah, and I think that we've seen over over the summer, the last couple of months, how these activists are starting to engage in what you might call the formal political process. We saw Black Lives Matter activists in, I think, probably the biggest profile, disrupting some of the Democratic 2016 candidate speeches at I think it was the Netroots Nation conference over the summer, and then later one of Bernie Sanders' speeches kind of trying to engage that way. And we saw a lot of criticism on probably the tactics involved. And I think within the movement, as you've written about and I've seen others write about, there's an ongoing discussion on how the best way is to engage with, the formal party structure in America. And largely, obviously, they're focusing on the Democratic Party because politicians there are probably going to be a little more amenable to the goals of the movement. So I've seen, there are formal organizations like the Black Lives Matter Network and Campaign Zero trying to, I think, engage a little more formally. And then there's, you have this problem, I think, that we've seen with mass movements like Black Lives Matter, like Occupy Wall Street, like the Tea Party movement, where it starts with no formal hierarchical structure, right? So organizing in these formal political ways is a little more harder, and I think there are always going to be some growing pains in talking about what tactics to use, talking about what organizations to work with. So what I'm wondering. I think on your part, what do you think some of these tactics should be going forward in order to make the biggest difference?
Yeah, so that's it's a complicated question because initially it was protesting going to the streets, and then this second wave of interrupting politicians and demanding that they answer questions and have policies that address race issues in America was like the second wave, the new approach, and that got initial feedback or pushback because it wasn't as polite, I guess, as we would like to view the political process. And so the new stage, it's funny because the most, in my opinion, the most productive is actually going to look kind of chaotic because you're going to have competing entities like Campaign Zero and Black Lives Matter out there doing similar things. Like the idea that everyone wants is for there to be one voice, one entity that you kind of get all of your information for regarding what African Americans want and how do you combat criminal justice issues and all of that. But they're probably going to be two to three, which is kind of how it always is with politics or any kind of movement or ideology. There's going to be competing entities, and even during the civil rights movement, there were like three, four, five different groups competing for all of the same opportunities to advance Black life. So right now, the next wave is organizing these individuals who have been passionate for well over a year, and now drawing up policy initiatives and approaches that will make that could make a difference, and seeing which one like is best at working with the big political entities and is best at coming up with proposals that can work. And that's the next wave, I'd say.
Yeah, I wonder if how much of this is a problem of the media, because the media wants to say, wants to, I guess, think of these social movements in terms of, formal organizational structures. So they want to be able to say, here's a leader, we can go to this person and get a press release or whatever. And I think that attitude on the media's part is very outdated at this point. And I think it's a hard thing and I think it's unfair to a lot of these mass movements that the media kind of operates like this, because, and I've seen this written about, a lot of social movements, a lot of protests, the media likes to portray them as kind of on a mass level representative of the worst person there. So when one person is out of line, perpetuates violence, they say the entire movement is violent. In the case of the Tea Party, they say this one person holding a Confederate flag is representative of the entire Tea Party movement. And I think that this is a problem on the media's part that A, they're looking for sensationalism, and B, they want to categorize these mass social movements in terms of a formal hierarchical structure, which leads to, I think, a bad thing in that the people who are trying to follow along with the traditional mainstream media get the wrong impression of what's going on.
Yeah, I'd say there's definitely some issues concerning how the media portrays the Black Lives Matter movement, and there's a lot of. So first of all, a key component of what I try to do as a columnist is I try to look at these complex issues and express them and show that they are complex, but say them in a way that people can understand. But too often, you can tell that there's an emphasis on just making it seem simple. Like, it's really easy. There's one person, there's one thing. They all think this. They're all good. They're all bad. And that's just the quick, easy way to express it instead of saying, this is complex. These are human beings, and just like it takes time to grow anything, it's going to take time for this to get organized. I think just due to the history of America and how Black Americans have been portrayed for a long time, there's a greater inclination to view the disarray or lack of organization amongst African Americans to be something negative, or that's the systemic problem, or that's the big fear, and that they will never get organized. They won't get chaotic, and they'll be chaotic, and they won't get the chance to organize just like everybody else always does. Where when there's a lot of people and a lot of things going on, it takes a while to get it together and make sense of it. And this desire to make everything seem simple also means that when two or three groups are presenting the voice or the perspectives of African Americans, that will then be portrayed as, oh, it's even more chaotic. They can't get it together. When, you know, it will take people forever just to talk about the organization of the Tea Party movement and all these different Tea Party factions across the United States. And I think so. Yeah, so it's I think it's kind of twofold. It's just this general idea of how we like to portray African Americans and large masses of African Americans in like the American mainstream, and just the media's desire to like simplify things. And sometimes that can be a bit dangerous because you'll just simplify it too much and not respect the complexity that is just being a person, you know?
Yeah. I think one of the telling instances recently, and you wrote about this, was the Democratic National Committee kind of put out a statement saying that they wanted to bring in BLM activists. They wanted to work with the movement. And some BLM activists, and I would say probably those who are now more associated with Campaign Zero, said this is a good idea. We should work with the DNC, with the formal party structure. But some BLM activists rejected that kind of outreach and said, you know, we're not going to be formally affiliated with either mainstream partisan outlet in the United States, and B, not going to be pigeonholed probably by the political establishment that has for so long kind of rejected them. And I'm wondering what your take on, you know, how this, like you said, you've been describing it kind of chaotically as chaos. How out of this chaos, any, I guess, formal cooperation between the political establishment and between these activists is going to look like. I mean, obviously we have Campaign Zero now started by a bunch of BLM activists that has kind of a formal party platform, some pretty nice marketing as far as what I've seen. But then there's also that massive activist that kind of says, you know, by even organizing or putting things down like this, we're going to be alienating people on our movement, and that's not the best way forward for us.
Yeah, I guess the key thing is when you find out what's the goal of each entity, you know, like, because right now it's just a lot of people that have a similar desire for something to change. Now, what does success look like? Because when you look at Occupy Wall Street and all these other kind of like grassroots movements, sometimes the goal of the organization is just to get this conversation in the national dialogue. They don't want to engage with the powers that be, because that would feel that would alienate their base. That would be working with the man, or, you know, the people that they don't agree with. And so the goal could be for some of these like splintering groups to just keep the discussion alive. And it could also, and then there could be Campaign Zero, and their goal is to actively work with the powers that be to get the change that they want to occur. And if you want to combat the systemic problems in America, like, you have to work with the system. It's kind of this catch-22 where the entity that you don't like, that you are complaining about, they are the entity that you have to work with to then fix the problem. And that, you know, that just causes a problem for people mentally to kind of cope with, where you have to work the structure that you don't like. And when a movement is based really to a large degree on emotions and emotional connections, having like a negative feeling about your actions can be a bit too hard for people to take. So it's like there's a required level of like pragmatism when it comes to organizing, and it looks like Campaign Zero is really all about adding that level of pragmatism to get things done. And another group may not want to be that pragmatic, and they just want to keep the conversation alive, which is beneficial, but not as beneficial as, you know, changing laws and things like that actually impact people on a macro level.
Yeah. I have to say, I think, and not to cast my lot, but I do sympathize with the people who are kind of against the formal structure and organization here. I think that they've largely been successful, at least over the last couple of months, when we saw at Netroots Nation the kind of spark over the summer, where I think it was Martin O'Malley who said all lives matter, and there were other Democratic politicians saying the same. And kind of the message at that point wasn't, we have this campaign platform of criminal justice reforms that we're pushing. It was merely to get candidates to recognize kind of the fundamental core aspect of the movement. And I think that they were very successful in that. I think that you see now in the Democratic establishment the recognition of what the Black Lives Matter movement is about, because it is kind of verboten in at least, the top level Democratic Party operatives now to say to push back against saying Black Lives Matter and respond with all lives matter. And so I think that those activists who have rejected having a platform have largely been successful in, I guess, starting that conversation, at least getting politicians to recognize the core aspect of the movement to this point. And maybe you might say, what use is that for politicians to recognize that at all? But I do feel like that is a very good first step in moving towards actual reforms, actual policy goals. But I also think it is important to change people's kind of way of thinking at a fundamental level. Even if you don't say, mandatory minimum sentencing needs to be reformed, and a politician says yes or no, and that just getting them to acknowledge where a movement is coming from and kind of the mindset of that movement is going to get a politician thinking differently on a couple of the issues that you want them to be thinking differently about.
Yeah, exactly. And I frankly think changing the conversation, creating a connection, people understanding that your perspective on the criminal justice system and how it's flawed and how it disproportionately harms African Americans is essential, and getting people to understand that so that policymakers, on their own, they understand these issues and they want to go and change it. You don't have to go in there and kind of like hold their hand and make sure that they do it right. They already get it. Like, that's one of those things that we need as a society. But it's kind of like we're in the campaign season right now, and when you look at politicians, there's kind of, you need to connect to them on an emotional level to even listen to what they want to say for their policies or what they want to enact if they get elected, and then you pay attention to what their policies look like. It's kind of like politicians have to be able to do both of them, connect with the citizens on an emotional level, but also show that they can act in the proper way to make the change that's required. And so the interruptions, the changing the discussion, making sure that the Democratic politicians are aware of how important Black Lives Matter is and why it's Black Lives Matter and not all lives matter, or any other kind of derivation, is essential. It's changing the mindset, and that is very, very key. But that's not the only thing that needs to be done, because we are talking about systemic change. So it's like the systemic change is a macro problem, and relating to politicians and people one-on-one is a micro problem. So getting out there and relating one-on-one and changing the hearts and minds of people is absolutely essential. It needs to happen. But you also need to have people go in there and make sure that the policies that get created do what we would like them to do, what we're all working towards accomplishing. And so, like, at the end of the day, there could be still 2 to 3 different Black Lives Matters groups, but that could be essential, because one might focus more on policy and one might focus more on just kind of one-on-one interaction to change the minds of Americans, and that just needs to happen.
Right. I think one of the things that we've seen in polling attitudes among Americans that has popped up since Michael Brown's death in Ferguson and kind of the explosion onto the national scene of all of these racial justice issues that the activists are pushing, is an acknowledgement of at least probably a good portion of white America that a lot of these racial justice issues are still issues in America. Because I think, and this is just me as someone who observes the media both from the inside and the outside, I guess, that before Barack Obama's tenure, there was kind of an apathy around race issues in America. and a very large majority of white Americans thought that, you know, quote unquote racism is over and there aren't all of these issues that we need to address in America. And I think since Ferguson, since Eric Garner, since a lot of these high profile deaths of African Americans have been in the media in the last, year and a half now, that a lot of people are taking these issues seriously, are taking issues of, obviously policing, but segregated neighborhoods, segregated schools, much more seriously than they have in the past. And I think that in and of itself is a fairly big accomplishment for the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think it's not just related to criminal justice issues, though those are very, very important right now.
Yeah, it's, if we want to if we start with Obama's presidency, one of the things that was just profound is it made white Americans and all Americans have to see a black person every day. And it wasn't like a black person on TV that was playing a role. This was like a real live black person, and you saw him every day. You saw him interact with his family. You saw him make important decisions. You got to see how people responded to him being president. You got to see the amount of people that were questioning his birth certificate and if he was smart enough to get into Harvard and all of these like just weird, bizarre issues that you don't see happening with white presidents. And it makes everyone have to stop and think like, oh man, this issue that I thought was, not an issue anymore, because personally, I don't feel like that. Now I can see on TV that maybe some of the ideas that I had that I thought were okay need to be modified. Maybe the perceptions that I didn't think this level of racism exists in America, I need to modify that because I'm seeing it every day. And I personally, I noticed that more white Americans wanted to have conversations with me about race issues, just casually. They'd see Obama and they'd see something and they'd say like, "Hey, let's talk. I didn't know this, Barrett. Let's chat about it." And it's been just years and years of just casual conversations where like the level of empathy and understanding has grown across the races, because whether you think about it or not, America has a long history of like unintentional and intentional segregation when it comes to housing, where like people, it's just a natural inclination to want to live around people that are similar to you. Like everyone wants to do that, but America is one of these few countries that's so big that you can always move and ensure that you're surrounded by people that are just like you. Like most countries that are a lot smaller, you just have to tolerate being around people that are dissimilar because you just can't go anywhere else. And that ability to constantly move has allowed people to move. And whether you don't hold any like racist tendencies or don't believe that you do, if you aren't interacting with people that are differently than you, it's very easy to have a lot of misconceptions about how they see the world, what their day-to-day life is like, and all of that kind of stuff. And just having to see Barack Obama every day made people start asking these basic questions to themselves, like over and over and over again. And then when Trayvon Martin happened, like the thing that I kind of talked to my family and a lot of people about is like these crimes against African Americans that are happening right now, these aren't new. It's just that as a society, we now collectively care about them. And, Obama was elected in 2008, and Trayvon Martin, that was like 4 or 5 years later. Like, so it was a progression of just caring about people that to a degree that people didn't know they needed to. And maybe they already thought that they were. But now that you have to interact with African Americans on a day-to-day basis, you see one every day, new conversations emerge, and a slow, gradual, subtle change happens. And then when Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Eric Garner happened, collectively we're all outraged because we all now see it. And that's probably one of the most profound things that I could say from Barack Obama. Just people saw a black person every day, and he didn't go along with these like negative ideas that they try to present far too often. Like the Obamas are probably one of the most idyllic families you could imagine. They brought the grandmother in to live in the White House to help raise the kids. Like that's just fantastic, And so,
yeah, I think that's a really interesting theory. Just the exposure on a day-to-day basis of white Americans to at least a black American who's the leader of the country. And what's interesting is in the, I guess, I don't know if you would call it a parallel, another movement, the gay rights movement. One of the things that a lot of people have pointed to in the fairly fast social change of acceptance of gay people, both legally and kind of on a personal level, is knowing a gay person. And you look at people's attitudes towards gay people. If they know a gay person, their attitudes are far more tolerant, far more kind of in line with progressivism. And that's not always the case with black people. You know, a lot of white Americans, like you said, live in neighborhoods where everybody looks like them. And just the mere exposure to someone who's not like you makes you more tolerant. And I think that's a really good observation, that kind of seeing Barack Obama on TV all the time, knowing that he's the leader of your country, he represents all Americans, might be a point for a kind of sea change in people acknowledging that that black people are no different than anybody else.
Right. It's one of these just really bizarre things where if you don't live around somebody, you're not exposed to a different group of people, your idea of like who that person is or what that group is can be anything. You could think they're the best thing in the world. You could think they're the worst thing in the world. But you have to interact with them. And with African Americans, there's just been such a long history of segregation and dehumanizing identifiers that people, I think, to a certain degree, don't know how ingrained that is within themselves because it's always been there. That's just like how the country's always been structured. And so when you see Barack Obama, and whether you disagree with him on policies, it's like, that's a stand-up guy. Like, he's just seems like a good person. And he kind of doesn't fit along with the narrative. And having that constant, like, rebuttal of these, like, American, conceptions of black males and African American families, just, it's naturally going to facilitate conversations and questions, and that's key. And one of the things that I think is really significant about Black Lives Matter and most of the really impactful African American movements is they've always advocated for peaceful protesting, nonviolence. We want to engage with people, and we want to create like a diverse tapestry of people supporting it. Like, there's no one that says white people can't support Black Lives Matter, or Asian people or Indian people. It's like everybody can support Black Lives Matter. And that inclusiveness creates conversations, and it creates a change of mentalities. Even if, like, at certain times it might not be how you'd ideally like to draw it up, such as the Netroots Nation and the interruptions of Bernie Sanders, you can see the conversation that emerged after that and how the perspective changed after that resulted in him having policies like directly talking about race issues in America, creating getting a press secretary, an African American press secretary, just things like that. So when you have these conflicts of thought and questions, having black movements that encourage peaceful engagement and discussion, it makes good things happen.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about another piece that you wrote recently on some polling attitudes, kind of, and this is maybe going against what we were talking about, the possible increase in tolerance in America, is the perception among a fairly large swath of white people that racism against white people is now a more important and more prevalent problem than racism against black people. And I think you touched on an interesting point about kind of how people define racism, and whether they're thinking about these things in terms of the structural issues that we've all been, I guess, in the media and in the political movements have been talking about. And that for a lot of the people who aren't familiar and are, I would probably say, just coming to appreciate what structural racism really is, how it can be so foreign to us to see those people who say racism against white people is a more important problem right now, considering the structures that we look at, that we have been working in and with and against for a long time now, and it's kind of how odd it is for people who are familiar with those criticisms to see these white people who do think that they're the people who are being prejudiced against right now.
Yeah, so it's interesting because what we're talking about now is structural racism. That's kind of there's a new phrase going about that's like racism without racist, where like even if you don't have racist feelings towards black people or white people or Asian people or whatever, um, if you create structures that disproportionately harm them, then that's structural racism. And the United States just has plenty of those structures, and African Americans are trying to work against the continuation of those structures. So it's kind of like not a personal critique. It's just we don't like this structural entity that was built, and so we want to improve it so that it's more just for everybody. What's end up happening is like white Americans what I think is they feel a certain amount of ownership to these structures. Like we built this and we had good intentions, so don't you can't criticize us or say that we're racist, da 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 da. And it's like that's not the conversation. The conversation isn't about how you feel about yourself and how you feel about things that happened in the past, or how, we're not talking about one-on-one interactions here. And I just think that the criticism of these structures are being misinterpreted because they're just criticisms. So we're not actually attacking groups of people and saying to do harm to them because they are a group of, because they are one group of people. And that's kind of when, like, one-to-one racism, what it looks like. When one group says, this group of people are beneath us, they don't deserve things, we are entitled to harm them. That is just not what's happening to white Americans in the slightest. But that is what happened to African Americans for a very long time in America, and we fought quite hard to prevent that from continuing. And now, after fighting to kind of remove a lot of the one-on-one racism and like mob, like terroristic mentality that accompany a lot of that racism, especially in the South, we're confronting just the structures that were built that continue to oppress. And that's a very positive thing. I just think white Americans seem to be misinterpreting the criticism of the structures for criticism of them personally, and they're just two completely different things.
Right, and I think I think you hit the nail on the head. Is that if, for example, let's say someone makes a critique of neighborhood-based schooling as a legacy of racism, really. It's saying, obviously because of housing, because of income, because of government policy, we have neighborhoods that are predominantly white and neighborhoods that are predominantly black. And this produces a school system where the schools are predominantly white or black, and because it's all based on kind of neighborhood income, the schools, they have proportionally different resources, proportionally different outcomes, and that's a legacy of racism. And if you say, because of that, we can see these legacies of racism in our school system, and you say that to, let's say, a white person who lives in a good neighborhood, who sends their kids to a quote-unquote good school, they say, well, I like our school system. I'm not a racist for liking our school system. And because they interpret that critique of racism, like you said, on an individual level, and I think, like you said, they perceive some ownership, and they don't want to say, because I like our school system, that doesn't mean that I'm a KKK member and that I think that the white race is inherently superior to the black race. Because I think people are taking it still on and it's very dumb to bring some of these things up, but the dictionary definition of racism, which says, racism is the belief that there are inherent characteristics of different races that make them inherently different. And if you say that to a white person, they instinctively think of, the KKK member who thinks that white people are just superior to black people. And that's not what's going on with some of these criticisms, like you said. But I think that being able to make those criticisms and I think this is a problem of white people, and having white people not inherently kind of curl up into a ball and insist that, well, they're not personally racist, so, their defense of this possibly racist structure that has been set up can't be racist either, is a challenge. in trying to address some of these racial injustice issues.
Right. It's frankly what's happening right now is we're trying to inform people that their intent is not like the end all be all. Just because your actions, the intent of those actions is to do good or to give your kid an advantage or whatever, and you don't have negative intent towards another group of people, that doesn't mean that those actions collectively will be good for eternity. You know, like we need to assess the impact of the actions and not get fixated on the thoughts that may have guided them, because some things work really great at a micro level that just don't work at a macro level. That's just how it is. It's a scale issue, and that's kind of what's happening right now. And I think we're constantly crossing this like micro macro divide, and it's problematic because
Right.
the goal is to have conversations, to have discourse, and engage one another. And at some point, like, we're all going to be wrong at something. Like nobody is going to be correct all the time. And you have to have these types of conversations without people getting overly offensive and just due to basic criticisms. And that's kind of what's happening right now. People just kind of seem to misinterpret just basic criticisms for what they aren't intended to be, and they get focused or fixated on their intent or their feelings and not the impact of their actions. And it's the actions collectively, not the actions individually.
Right. Well, that is about all the time we have today. Thanks so much for coming on, talking about some of these things with me today, Barrett.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And I will see everyone next time on another episode of Rational Actors.